James Person is now in front of you. And James is the director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. Between 2007 and early 17, he served as the founding coordinator for the North Korean International Documentation Project at the Wilson Center. Between 13 and 17, he was the deputy director of the History and Public Policy program, and he holds a PhD in modern Korean history. His principal research interests include modern Korean history, inter-Korean relations, the DPRK foreign relations, and as you probably know, DPRK stands for Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Is that right? Okay. Sometimes when I'm talking, my mind goes elsewhere because I'm looking at you, you look at me and I'm going, what was I going to say? And I'm looking at you for the answer and you're saying, huh? Okay, so he also specializes in his expertise in the Cold War in Asia, and his PhD dissertation explored the transformation of North Korea's political, ideological, and political systems between 1953 and 1967. So let's just acknowledge he knows just about everything about how the Korean War set the foundation and the stage for what we're experiencing today. He teaches courses on modern Korean history at the George Washington University, and he's no stranger to public speaking. He appeared on CBS, C-SPAN, NPR, Vice News, KBS, and his interviews have appeared in Newsweek, CNN, USA Today, the LA Times, and the Donga Daily, and other outlets.
Thanks to Mary and the United Nations Association, also to the American Legion, and to San Francisco State University's Gen UN. I regret that I'm unable to join you in person today, but happy to be joining you from Washington, D.C. I'm actually going to pick up on one of the very last points that Katharina made about pressure and sanctions not resolving the problem with North Korea. The pressure and sanctions are designed to try to bring North Korea to its knees, to convince Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea, that the cost of maintaining a nuclear program is just too high, and to force him to negotiate on denuclearization. There are two reasons that I think this is not going to be effective, and I will just say up front that I agree completely with Katharina that ultimately there will need to be direct engagement with North Korea. Now, the first reason is connected to the goal of sanctions. The second is the effectiveness of sanctions on North Korea. You've heard from Katharina that about some of the changes, but I will come back and address some of the reasons that these changes will not directly impact the regime's willingness to negotiate on the nuclear program. So again, the first, what are the goals of sanctions? Well, so the strategy of relying on sanctions is based on the assumption that North Korea sees its nuclear program as negotiable, that they'd be willing to use it as a bargaining chip. The problem is that history tells us that this is no longer the case. North Korea today sees its nuclear weapons as a necessity. It's a necessity to preserve the regime and to deter attack. For the North Koreans, there is a credible defensive rationale to this program. North Korea is I think, an acute case where history has made all the difference. And through a careful study of North Korea's history, we can discern a clear understanding that its country's leaders see the world as being inherently predatory and malign, that they are paranoid and mistrustful. They've long viewed the world as inherently predatory. And this paranoia is extended not just toward their perceived foe, that is the United States, but also toward their supposed allies throughout the Cold War, toward both the Soviet Union and China, and today toward China. North Korea's leaders have perceived for decades an existential threat that we cannot discount. We have to give some credence to it. The North Koreans have been living under the shadow of nuclear threat since the Korean War. MacArthur made some threats very early on in the war, but in 1953, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles made some direct threats with the blessings of the president that if the Chinese and the North Koreans did not break deadlocks in negotiations, then the U.S. would consider using nuclear bombs. 5 years later, the United States in 1958 began introducing tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula, including nuclear-armed Honest John missiles and 280 millimeter atomic cannons to South Korea. And this was done in violation of Article 13D of the Korean War Armistice. Now, up to that point, the North Koreans they could live with this. Why? Because they enjoyed the extended deterrent of the Soviet Union. They lived under the Soviet nuclear umbrella. Things began to change, however, in the early 1960s. The North Koreans began to rethink their strategy on relying on this Soviet nuclear umbrella after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is an event that occurred 8,000 miles from North Korea's borders. But the North Koreans saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis evidence that the Soviets were not credible, that they couldn't outsource their national security policy to another country. They looked at it and they thought, well, so the Soviets betrayed the Cubans. They sold out to the Americans. They caved into US pressure. And if push comes to shove, they're going to do the same with us. If we are threatened, the Soviets are not going to back us. And you can see from early '63 evidence of North Korean interest in obtaining technology that is used to develop nuclear weapons. Now, it would be decades before they could actually build on this, but you could see in a lot of the documents that have since emerged from former communist bloc archives that there was a genuine interest, that they were reaching out through many channels to try to get technology to develop nuclear weapons. Now, there's some evidence that the North Koreans were still willing to negotiate away the program in the early 1990s. It was still negotiable. They were willing to trade it for a security assurance from the United States, which would have included replacing the Korean War Armistice with a permanent peace agreement, which would have meant the normalization of relations, and it would have meant economic assistance. Basically, move toward full normalization of political and economic relations. And we were making some progress on that front in the 1994 agreed framework. But as soon as we entered the agreement, United States Congress changed hands, and funds were not appropriated for some of the key provisions, including heavy fuel oil, which was to be supplied to the North Koreans who were in the midst of a crisis and a famine that was worsening. We also dragged our feet on breaking the ground on the 2 light water nuclear reactors that we promised to build to the North Korea, or for the North Koreans. The North Koreans on their side also balked at some provisions in the agreed framework, but in short, the agreement on our side, we basically entered into this agreement with the understanding that North Korea was not going to be around very long. It wasn't going to last long enough that we would have to actually move toward full normalization of political and economic relations with the country. We didn't expect that it would last long after the collapse of the socialist camp, and yet it did. Now, the two events since that time have made the North Korean nuclear program non-negotiable. So whereas in the 90s, the North Koreans were willing to negotiate it away, that's no longer the case. And so their paranoia has been reinforced. The first is the invasion of Iraq, a country with an unrealized nuclear program that was toppled. And secondly, the execution of Gaddafi in Libya. Here you had a leader that voluntarily abandoned his nuclear weapons program, in exchange for improved relations with the West, in exchange for integration, only to be executed in the streets by NATO-backed rebels. Now, we can have a discussion about the nature of NATO involvement in Libya as a humanitarian operation. The North Koreans, however, don't see it that way. They simply see the lesson of here's this person who gave up his nuclear program and he was later toppled. So the North Koreans are paranoid and mistrustful, and they're not going to walk away now from something that they are so close to achieving after trying to develop it for nearly 5 decades, again, since the early 1960s. And to threaten North Korea's nuclear capabilities is really to threaten the regime itself. Now, the second reason that I think relying on sanctions won't work is because sanctions, there are limits to the effectiveness of sanctions in North Korea. We've heard that there is now an impact, but I think the ability of sanctions to really bring about the change that we would expect or that we hope with North Korea abandoning its nuclear program are problematic. Let me just highlight a few reasons why the North Koreans, I think, are willing to withstand withstand things that would topple most regimes, and really slow down the time that it would take for them to we're demonstrating that the timelines are really out of sync for these sanctions to achieve the desired goal of bringing the North Korean regime to its knees, forcing it to understand that the nuclear program is just not worth taking, and the progress that they're making on their nuclear program and ballistic missile technology. These timelines are out of sync. So one reason is that the North Koreans have been living under sanctions-like conditions since really the Korean War. And they really learned to live without. Even though they did benefit from trade and technology from advanced socialist countries throughout the Cold War, there were times when, for example, when relations were poor with the Soviets, that the North Koreans didn't have regular access to advanced goods and technologies from other socialist countries, including the Soviets and their Central and Eastern European partners. Likewise, when relations were poor with the Chinese, they didn't have regular access from goods and supplies from China. Another reason is that North Korea is not integrated into the global economy. They didn't even integrate into the socialist economic bloc fully. They enjoyed hub and spokes relations with other members of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, but they didn't fully integrate because they feared a loss of freedom of action. And integration into the global economy, I think, is important for sanctions to really be effective, both in terms of what can be sanctioned from exports, and this is something where people will point to the success with Iran, because they were dependent on, in many ways, on their oil exports. It also, the lack of North Korea's integration into the global economy also means that fewer people are really exposed fewer people in the North Korean population are really exposed to directly to the sanctions, which again limits the effectiveness. Third, the North Koreans are skilled at mobilizing indigenous human and material resources. We are seeing, as Katerina said, evidence of sanctions having an impact, but the North Koreans have demonstrated time and again that they can make do, muddle through by mobilizing, again, human and material resources, indigenous human and material resources. This is something that they did in the 1950s and in other periods in their history. I also think another major limit to the effectiveness of sanctions is yes, China is stepping up now and is doing more to bring North Korea, to try to bring North Korea in line, and to demonstrate, at least cosmetically, to the United States that it's doing things to fall more in line with sanctions, with international sanctions regimes. But there are limits to what China will do. It's not going to bring the North Korea or bring the regime to its knees. It's not going to bring it to the point of collapse. They don't want a nuclear North Korea. But even more than that, they don't want a unified Korean state and U.S. treaty ally at their doorstep, especially as China is trying to reassert its traditional hegemony in East Asia through a zone of deference. And finally, I think another reason that it'll take longer for sanctions to really have a major impact is that the North Koreans can impose the cost of sanctions on citizens. And I think sadly, the regime considers it an acceptable loss for a segment of the population to perish before the vital national interests of the regime are impacted. Here, I mean, before the Kim family and the patronage network that supports it really impacted. So for these reasons, I think ultimately it will require direct talks between the United States and North Korea in coordination with our allies to really bring about an end to North Korea's concerns that would then at some point consider abandoning the nuclear program. There are a number of steps that I think could be taken. There are some economic inducements that I think should be considered. I'm happy to return to these in the Q&A. Thank you.
Mr. Pearson, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the first question is for you. What does the North Korean government want that would pacify them, to get them to back away from threatening war with the USA, and what is blocking us giving it to them?
I mean, it really goes back to this history and and the paranoia that I think is at the foundation of their worldview. Again, where they see the world as being inherently predatory, and they do perceive a threat from the United States. What they've wanted, really going back to 1974, they actually reached out to the United States in March '74 for the very first time. And they've been pretty consistent in what they've been asking of the United States. They do want just replace the Korean War armistice with a peace agreement. They want normalized relations with the United States. They want economic relations with the United States. These are three of the major components. Now, there is the concern that with the replacement of the armistice and the peace agreement, that would mean that they're trying to sever the relationship with South Korea. We don't know, because we haven't had a chance to really talk about the details of this. This is an assumption we have. In many ways, I think this is projecting onto the North Koreans what we expect them to desire out of the, securing a peace agreement. But they've wanted these things, and I think this actually gives us. If we were to try to actually sit down and talk with them about these, and to try to really achieve these three goals, which would benefit us in many ways, that would be the most effective way to actually get them to consider over the long term abandoning their nuclear program, because they've again, since 1974, they've been trying to secure these things. They've been, they don't like the situation that they're in now because they feel insecure. But more importantly, they also understand that they are isolated and dependent on China, which they don't want. One thing that we get wrong, horribly wrong here in the United States, North Korea's relationship with China. There is this perception here in Washington that the Chinese have all the answers. We've heard President Trump say all the Chinese have to do is flip a switch and they can solve the problem. But there is a profound sense of mistrust at the basis of that relationship, and really in Pyongyang toward Beijing, a profound sense of mistrust, and this belief going back decades that China has been overly interventionist and not respectful of Korean sovereignty. It's to the point where today, if we ask China to exercise political influence over North Korea, we're asking them to do precisely what the North Koreans have most resented. The North Koreans today are utterly dependent on China, and they can't stand that. This would actually be a great way. So working with, or trying to actually, in considering opening economic relations with the North Koreans, we would permit them to offset that dependence on China, which is something that they've wanted, something that they would want more than anything, I think, at this point. And would go a long way toward again improving the relationship, establishing some sort of modus vivendi, and eventually getting us to a point where we could seriously talk about denuclearization on the peninsula. There's a lot that can be done. Not talking is not achieving our goals, and it's only going to make the situation worse and increase the risk of miscalculation, which is growing with every day.
I get this job because I can read the handwriting. The elephant in the room, other countries taking over other nations to privatize nations. How can we address the systemic concerns to prevent World War III?
Which is actually one of the reasons, this is something that the North Koreans have been concerned with going back decades. This is one of the reasons they've never even integrated into the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which was the socialist bloc, the socialist camp's trade bloc. They feared losing their freedom of action of larger, more developed socialist countries coming in and telling them what to do, what to export, what to produce, and they recognized it'd be a small, underdeveloped country with lots of holes in the ground where their mineral resources were extracted and shipped off to China and the Soviet Union. Today, this remains one of the major reasons North Korea is unlikely to open its door to globalization, to integration into the global economy. We see this oftentimes as an inducement to the North Koreans, as a way to get them, this is a carrot that we see. For them, this is actually another stick. They don't want to integrate into the global economy because they understand that you will have then Western, not just countries, but companies going in and dictating to them, and they would lose that freedom of action, especially today when the economy is not as strong as it was in, for example, the 1960s, when their economy was actually doing quite well, much better than even that of South Korea. So today they understand that they would lose that freedom of action, that they would become essentially the small underdeveloped country with lots of holes in the ground where major corporations are coming in dictating to them That's something that again is not an inducement, but they see that as a stick. I hope I've answered the question.
And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, we've run out of time. And so we're not going to take any more questions at this time, but all of the questions that we got on the index cards were excellent. And Katerina's going to be sticking around, so I want you to feel free to come up and talk to her directly about your question. And James Person, his email address is readily available. If you Google him, you'll get pages and pages, and you can reach out to him directly. Okay. So I have the privilege of kind of just making some observations and wrapping up a little bit. And again, I want to say how touched I am. And we have the art part of the program coming up next. And I think it's just beautiful that we're talking politics and art together. Because politics and world wars depress me. And art and beautiful dancers lifts me up. And singing lifts me up. So I think it's good that we have that. You know, it's kind of like having vegetables and a nice dessert. Because I don't like all vegetables. But getting back to the unpleasant part of the challenging part of our world situation and the concern that all of us share about what can we do to de-escalate. And I think one of the main points that I noted from Katerina's comments is that the people are suffering. And as Mr. Person said, as far as the government's concerned, they are so paranoid about losing their independence and being taken over. And he cited examples from other countries that they're relying upon. So their concerns are not without foundation. And Mr. Person said something I really latched onto. He said, as far as the North Korean government goes, the people's suffering is an acceptable loss in order for them to maintain their national identity. And we Americans, I don't think I can speak for everybody, I'll just speak for myself and people who acknowledge this, that tougher sanctions is what we need. A bigger bat. We need to hit them harder in the head. But we're not hitting the leaders in the head, we're hitting the people in the head. And the leaders have decided that that's acceptable if that's the cost. And I don't know, it's probably not fair to flip it around and say, what if it was us? And what if we were fighting for the independence of the United States of America? How many citizens would be willing to die for the independence of the United States of America? Probably a lot. Because we believe in our country and what it stands for. And so somebody who puts sanctions on us would be strengthening our resolve. As Mr. Person says, we're doing in North Korea. And we look at it in this light, we're missing the boat completely. We're bringing us to the brink of something that may be quite terrible. And as Mr. Person said, and I actually had an engagement and a conversation on Facebook with somebody the other day, he said, we've already tried talking to them, tougher sanctions is the only answer. And I was very happy to hear today, and I'm going to close on this note, a happy note, that Mr. Persons has identified, and Katerina's identified, very possible ways that we could de-escalate this whole situation and turn it into a positive engagement. Engage with them on the levels that Katerina shared with us, a humanitarian level. Engage with them on a political level that Mr. Pearson's shared with us. I was very happy to hear that North Korea has been reaching out since 1974 with certain requests that Mr. Pearson's identified, such as changing the armistice into a peace agreement and allowing us to have normalized relationship with North Korea. Do we want to have normalized relationships, or do we want to have conflict? It seems like a no-brainer. There's a commercial that says, this is the biggest no-brainer in the history of the world. And I think this is something that we should consider as we leave here today. And on that note, I'd like to thank you for this part of our program and for sitting through it. And I look forward to chatting with all of you or any of you. and I know our speakers do as well.
Yes, bravo. Bravo.